Gaming is my favorite hobby. I love discussing video games in depth and analyzing the various pros and cons from my favorite franchises. It's why I made this channel in the first place. The video games were always this thing where you could just get lost in the experience. You played a game because it was fun, because it challenged you, or because it told a story you connected with. Discussions around games online, from forums to Reddit to YouTube videos, were almost always about mechanics, storylines, the quality of the design, or things that made the game unique. Sure, we had the usual which game is better debates, or we shared complaints we had with obviously bad games, but for the most part, these discussions were almost always about the games themselves. And that's really what I miss right now in the current gaming discourse. I just miss when we could talk about the game, not the social politics behind them, or whether or not the companies making them were trying to rob you blind with the egregious monetization practices. Just the game. But over the last few years, gaming discourse has gone in such an annoying but almost necessary direction. It feels like every conversation related to gaming has turned into a war zone between two different factions. We have gamers that defend the corporations and those that despise them, with almost no room left for honest discussions about the games themselves in the middle. Instead of focusing on whether a game is fun or well designed, whether the story is good, or discussing the different characters, instead we're busy arguing over things like microtransactions, and more recently, socio-political agendas in the games and studios. And the sad part is, as much as I hate these discussions, trust me, I much prefer talking about the games themselves. These conversations have unfortunately become necessary because things like social politics and microtransactions are ruining the gaming industry, especially social politics, which gamers everywhere are currently entrenched in a war zone as we speak. We can't escape this topic right now. Whether you're in the YouTube comments section, Steam reviews, Reddit, Twitter, everywhere in between, gaming discourse is primarily centered around the current social politics war. And really it's a war between gamers who defend the corporations and those that don't. But there's really four different factions that make up this battleground. We've got games media, we've got YouTube reviewers, and then we've got pro-corporation gamers and anti-corporation gamers. And right now it seems like it's the anti-corpo gamers versus everyone else. And that's why, despite not wanting to make videos like this, really I've only made maybe a handful out of my 300 videos on my channel talking about things like DEI or ESG, I feel it's necessary right now because I care deeply about this hobby, and we need to keep bringing up the things that are ruining our favorite hobby. Keep bringing attention to it, and keep it safe from egregious corruption and political propaganda. Up until about 10 years ago, gaming journalism used to play a critical role in shaping public opinion on games, guiding consumer choices, and influencing interesting topics of conversation about the ins and outs of video games. However, in recent years, the state of gaming journalism has devolved to such a disgraceful level that it borders on the edge of parody these days. The massive amount of blatant dishonesty, crystal clear biases surrounding certain narratives, and article after article being focused on overt sensationalism, which has completely destroyed any integrity these mainstream publications once had. While many of us grew up loving and respecting various game media sites, even buying their magazines at times, they've become nothing short of another cog in the propaganda machine that continues to divide gamers and destroy this hobby we all love. This erosion of gaming journalism isn't entirely new. Again, for over 10 years it's been steadily declining, and in response, many people began to seek out other opinions from real gamers, which gave rise to the YouTube reviewers. Problem is, YouTube reviewers have become almost just as dishonest, untrustworthy, and actively push the same talking points that we hope to escape from the gaming news outlets. It's frankly sad to see some of my favorite YouTube reviewers go from speaking for the gamer, standing up against the machine that pushes bullshit, to instead either ignoring this bullshit or are regurgitating that same mainstream propaganda themselves. Now we have both journalists and YouTube reviewers focused on pushing corporate talking points or promoting political narratives, rather than offering honest critiques of the games themselves. Or even sometimes sponsorships that are clearly biased and then blow up in their face once their audience gets their hands on the game. It's frustrating to watch something that once enhanced my gaming experience. You know, engaging in these fun discussions and disagreements, getting excited about the next release and speculating about details, rallying together around the idea of pushing the industry forward and demanding games be made for gamers first. But instead, both journalists and YouTube reviewers have devolved into this toxic, corporate-driven mess. So why have they both devolved to this level? I think one of the biggest reasons is the rise of echo chambers and groupthink. In this dark age of the toxic cesspool that is social media, journalists and YouTube reviewers are increasingly influenced by public opinion and online discussions. So when they see these heated debates on touchy subject, it's created these environments where I believe journalists and YouTubers began to feel immense pressure to conform to the most politically correct narrative within the gaming communities, especially on popular topics or highly anticipated releases. In the case of the latest DEI and ESG discussions, games media has clearly picked a side in this culture war and are bending over backwards to defend the corporations and the propaganda at every turn. And in the case of most of the biggest YouTube reviewers, they've either chosen to ignore these discussions entirely and pretend they don't exist, or they take the side of games media and poke fun at those with legitimate concerns. This pressure has led to a huge lack of diversity in opinion, which is ironic, and an unwillingness to cover controversial topics or negative reviews in a balanced way. How many games this year alone have we seen games journalists and YouTubers running defense for? Dragon Age the Veilguard is the latest example where journalists have been pushing this idea that it's one of the greatest games of all time, and will try to dunk on any dissenting view just because they agree with the social politics of the game. And many YouTube reviewers won't even mention the obvious socio-political propaganda in the game. Even if they were to agree with it, they don't even mention it. They just pretend it's not there. Concord is another example where mainstream media and YouTubers critique the game for every single reason except for the biggest and most glaring issue. They always avoid calling out these obvious problematic aspects of the game because doing so risks alienating a vocal minority in their fan base. Or they may be even scared of upsetting developers. They still want to get their early review copies after all. This politically correct mentality and self-censorship has stifled honest criticism and discussion around most modern games. And the outcome of self-censorship amongst the largest voices in the gaming community is that it reduces the chances the gaming community has to hold the publishers and studios accountable when they make decisions that disrespect our interests. But that's really the issue. There's a toxic positivity in games media and YouTube reviewers when it comes to the issues that most gamers have vocalized as being unpopular with them. But instead of covering the concerns gamers have with that in an honest way, they love to divide everyone with headlines like this. Then the rest of the article is filled with loads of biased coverage that prioritizes one side of the controversy over nuance. The result is a distorted portrayal of both the game, or games in question, and then the broader gaming community as a whole. Throwing out hateful labels and divisive language, then blaming the gamer for the failures of a studio when instead, games media and the studios have only themselves to thank. You can almost guarantee that if you see sites like IGN or Kotaku shitting on a specific game like Stellar Blade or Black Myth Wukong, then you know it's probably gonna be good. And if you see them shilling for a game like Unknown 9 Awakening or Dustborn, then you know it's probably gonna be shit. And I think that's one of the most important points to make here. Games media and the bigger YouTube reviewers at large have a massive disrespect for consumer interests. They often share a pretty dismissive attitude toward gamers' interests and feedback. Many journalists focus on promoting bad industry practices and aligning with developer interest more than representing the concerns of the gaming community itself. And like we pointed out with these headlines, they often attack gamers if they dare levy their complaints toward a specific game or studio. And if you share your issues about social politics infecting every aspect of modern games, you've got YouTubers ready to call you a bigot every chance they can, or just ignore the topic altogether, even though it's a massively important issue surrounding the discussion of the game at the time. And someone like The Act Man, or Yang Ya, two dudes I used to have a lot of respect for, watched for years, in recent years have completely lost their balls and simply ignore the topic altogether, or make arguments in bad faith to go after the people who have genuine valid criticism related to the topics. Actman used to be on the forefront of critiquing the game's media for their obvious propaganda in the past. Yang Ya used to call out the feminists that were dead set on crippling the industry with their inflammatory hit pieces. They always weighed in on topics like this, but nowadays they're silent. or they pretend to not even know what people are talking about when it comes to political propaganda in our games. The rise of political and social agendas in gaming is undeniable. It's in our face constantly from games media, from publishers and developers, and unfortunately from a large number of gamers who have succumbed to the propaganda in their own lives. And now they back the corporations that are pushing these agendas. In recent years, it feels like every game is now a platform for some sort of message, whether it's about gender, race, or social politics. And I've been clear in several of my previous videos that I'm all for natural diversity, like playing as a Native American man during the Revolutionary War. Connor fucking hates the white man, but his motivations and his character make sense for the context of the world and the narrative. Or if we look at another Assassin's Creed game like Adewale in Black Flag. Born as a slave in Trinidad, joining up with Edward Kenway, becoming his quartermaster, liberating slaves all around the Caribbean from the Spanish. Dude's a fucking badass that completely fits into the context of the world. But race-swapping Angrboda in God of War to be black just doesn't make sense when she's a Norse giantess that's supposed to look like this. And I've heard the argument that if Angrboda being black in God of War takes you out of the game because it isn't realistic, then you're an idiot because this is a game with magic and monsters, but you draw the line at a black Angrboda? But of course this argument falls apart immediately when you suggest that maybe the Black Panther should be a Chinese guy, and everyone in Wakanda just accepts it and ignores it and doesn't make mention of it or find it weird. But of course, that's retarded. Black Panther should be black, and Angrboda should be white. This isn't a hard concept to understand. Nobody has a problem with diverse characters. We've had them for decades, and they've been loved by the gaming community. The issue here isn't the idea of diversity. It's that these race swaps, gender swaps, or retconning of the lore to appeal to modern social politics feels forced or artificially inserted into games that weren't designed with those themes in mind. This makes games feel less like organic storytelling and more like activists making an attempt to cater to a particular group or ideology. When these issues are shoehorned into games for the sake of ticking boxes, rather than being integrated naturally into the story or world, and when a game is praised purely for its political alignment rather than its gameplay or world design or authenticity, it's easy to see how the whole discussion can become more about defending or criticizing a specific set of beliefs than evaluating the game on its own merits. And that's why gaming discourse is where it is right now. You have developers and publishers pushing a specific message due to funding from large corporations like BlackRock, and their workforce is comprised of people who have already bought into this ideology themselves, which makes it that much more prevalent. You then have games media constantly pushing the same ideologies at the top of their lungs, making sure every article is about pushing the message instead of covering games honestly. And then you have the largest game reviewers on YouTube who ignore or deny the existence of this happening at all. And then journalists, YouTube reviewers, and developers all act surprised when channels criticizing them start to blow up in popularity. Maybe it's because everyone can see through your obvious biases and agendas. And in the case of the YouTube reviewers, people notice when you don't point out the obvious and most talked about aspects of a game. People know when you ignore the elephant in the room or you say that there isn't one. So what can we do about it? How can we fix the broken state of gaming discourse? Well, we could just ignore it forever and never talk about it again, and slowly watch the gaming industry be killed in front of our eyes. Or we could keep talking about these issues until they're resolved. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I'd rather not make videos like this, and I will continue to make videos about topics other than this, I promise. I like talking about games more than this garbage. But we do need to keep pushing back against all of this DEI, ESG, socio-political propaganda. I think everyone should start supporting more independent YouTubers who aren't afraid to speak out against these things, even if it's controversial. It means we need to keep being vocal about our concerns when we see forced political messaging in our games. It means refusing to let the echo chambers dictate the conversation, and push for more diversity of thought in gaming discussions. At the end of the day, gaming is supposed to be fun. Discussing gaming is supposed to be fun, and if we want to restore that passion surrounding games, we need to focus on getting this stuff out of gaming as fast as possible so we can start focusing on things that actually matter. The games themselves.